Morning, I'm Jackie Miller, the host of the Reconciling Ways of Knowing online forum series. Joining you today from Lekwungen Territory in also known as Victoria, BC. Our session today is a conversation across ways of knowing and relating to land. And it is a follow-up discussion from a conversation that we started the beginning of the year with late last month, called Connecting Spiritually to the Land and Each Other, which is an important foundational conversation for our ongoing dialogue about bringing together or reconciling Indigenous ways of knowing and science together. The conversation last month was very focused on centering Indigenous ways of knowing and relating to the land, which carry a spiritual dimension for many Indigenous peoples. Our moderator and several of our panelists will reconnect us with that discussion and carry the conversation forward with a number of new guests in a conversation across ways of knowing and relating to the land. We'll pick up that conversation shortly. In the meantime, before we turn to the session itself, I have a few quick housekeeping notes. We've turned the chat feature off and will not be using the hands raised function. So please direct your questions to our moderator via the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screen. We will gather like questions together for the moderator and address all questions as time allows during a Q&A period after we hear from the panel and our RWoK conveners. Please submit your questions early. And please note that our speakers' technology connections may vary, so also please adjust your volume as needed. Today's dialogue will run for approximately 2 hours. We're recording the dialogue so that anyone who's unable to participate in the entire session can view it later online. But we're grateful if you can stay with us for the entirety of this discussion. And now I'm pleased to introduce our moderator for today, Dr. Nancy Turner, who will more formally begin the event. Dr. Nancy Turner is an ethnobotanist whose research integrates the fields of botany and ecology with anthropology, geography, and linguistics, amongst others. She's interested in the traditional knowledge systems and traditional land and resource management systems of Indigenous peoples, particularly in Western Canada. She's worked with Indigenous elders and cultural specialists in Northwestern North America for over 40 years, collaborating with Indigenous communities to help document, retain, and promote their traditional knowledge of plants and habitats, including Indigenous foods, materials, and medicines, as well as language and vocabulary relating to plants and environments. And with that said, over to you, Nancy.
Thank you very much, Jackie, and good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you today. I'm here on the traditional territory of the Snuneymuxw First Nation here off Nanaimo. And it's my pleasure first to introduce Chief Leah George Wilson, Sisia'ama of the Tsleil-Waututh First Nation, and she will provide the spiritual and territorial opening for this session. She's a respected leader and a lawyer, and she's at the forefront of recognizing Indigenous legal traditions. So Chief George Wilson, over to you.
ACM, thanking you, Nancy, for that kind introduction. ACM Nisiaya, I Tenishqualawan, quick snaletst, Anthesitsia Ama, the Mana Queth, Synthalia Islahotiam. The Amath Quethon Sakalot, Islahotiam, meets up Quitwilam Tenatamach, Tenahwamoch, Slewatash, Homathquiam, Skohomashoth. Greetings to our honored guests and my dear ones. I have good feelings in my heart to see all of you today. In our language called Kamitnum, I told you my name, Leah George Wilson. I told you who my parents are and who my grandparents are, because in our way, that information is important for you to know, so that you know that I know exactly who I am. And in our world, those things are important. And I welcomed you to, currently, I'm on Tsleil-Waututh territory, but in North Vancouver and Vancouver, we like to name our relatives that are in this area with us. So I welcomed you in Vancouver to the land of Tsleil-Waututh, Musqueam, and Squamish. Thanking all of you for joining us today. Also thanking the organizers, Miles and Jackie, for inviting me to come share a few words with you. It's my pleasure to be speaking to you ahead of incredible elders like Dr. Dave Courchene and Grandmother Katherine Whitecloud. It's an honor to be here with you as you talk about ways of knowing relating to land. Our own people, we know more than we think we know because we don't have it in the same kind of system that the mainstream society has it. All the things that our old people know about our land and what is there and the resources and how to access, that's all science. 10,000 years of knowing is science. And we need to remember that, and we need to respect that. The way that we take care of our land and our resources and our people, those ways are our snowayach. That's our law. That's the way that we do things. In everybody's language, they have words for the way. It's the way that our people do these things. And that's important to know. So it's important, as you'll hear fluent speakers after me. I'm not a fluent speaker, but you'll hear the connections between the language and the land and the people. And you cannot have one without the other. So these ways of knowing are imperative to our people. And I just want to thank you for listening to me, and thank you for having me here today. Haitsepka, thanking all of you.
Thank you, Chief George Wilson, for setting us up for the session in such a beautiful way. It makes a great foundation for our work that we're going to be doing. And I also want to send an acknowledgement to all of the First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples across the country, and welcome you to this session if you happen to be listening in. We began the conversation this year on January 26th with a dialogue connecting spiritually with the land and each other. Anishinaabe Elder Dr. Dave Courchene, Dakota Grandmother Katherine Whitecloud, and Dr. Blair Stonechild of the Muscopetung Salto Nation and professor at First Nations University spoke in dialogue with moderator Shauna Morgan Seegers and others about our fundamental connection to and inseparability from the world and from each other, and how this understanding carries a spiritual dimension for Indigenous peoples, reflected through ceremony, language, and narratives, confirming our relationships with all life and with the lands and waters of the earth. The intention with that dialogue was to hold space for this discussion to take shape as guided by spiritual direction, to begin the new calendar year off in a good way. Today's dialogue aims to carry forward that conversation in a conversation across ways of knowing and relating to land, recognizing Indigenous and other ways of knowing among Grandmother Katherine Whitecloud, Minister of Crown-Indigenous Relations Canada, Dr. Carolyn Bennett, Justice Harry Slade, and Dr. Fikret Berkes, and Elder Dr. Dave Courchene, with myself as the moderator. I want to thank each of you who are participating as viewers in this webinar and in the series that we've been offering. We appreciate your interest in these important topics and welcome you to this learning opportunity. And it's now my pleasure to provide you with some introduction to the panelists today. I'll give their backgrounds, each one, and then we'll start off with the presentations with questions that each of them will respond to. So I'd like to start with Grandmother Katherine Whitecloud. She's a mother, grandmother, community leader, and knowledge keeper from the Wipazoka Wakpa Dakota Nation. She has served her community for decades as chief, as director of education, and as an advocate for Indigenous health and wellness. She's been both Chief Executive Officer and Manitoba Regional Chief of the Assembly of First Nations and Director of the Assembly of Manitoba Chiefs, a member of the Turtle Lodge National Council of Elders and Knowledge Keepers. Grandmother Whitecloud is currently engaged in drawing on the knowledge of Indigenous knowledge keepers worldwide to build greater momentum for Indigenous-led Indigenous health systems across the country and beyond. We are so honored to have you with us today, Grandmother Whitecloud. The Honourable Dr. Carolyn Bennett, formerly a family physician and assistant professor in the Department of Family and Community Medicine at the University of Toronto, is our next speaker. She was first elected to the House of Commons in 1997, representing Toronto St. Paul's. An active and well-loved representative of her riding, she's been re-elected 7 consecutive times since. Currently the Minister of Crown-Indigenous Relations Canada, Dr. Bennett previously served as the Federal Minister of State for Public Health and in many other important roles. She's received many awards for her tireless advocacy work and is co-author of the book Kill or Cure: How Canadians Can Remake Their Healthcare System. Her present role has been to work in full partnership with Indigenous peoples and communities to advance meaningful reconciliation, particularly in the face of the devastating impacts on people's lives and livelihoods from the global pandemic. This means addressing the diverse inequities faced by Indigenous peoples, developing and implementing an Indigenous justice strategy, and building additional capacity for First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. We're so grateful to have you with us today, Minister Bennett. The next speaker will be the Honourable Justice Harry Slade, QC. He was admitted to the Bar of British Columbia in 1974. He practiced law at Radcliffe and Company in North Vancouver, British Columbia, focusing primarily in the area of Aboriginal law. He has extensive experience in specific claims negotiation, including the British Columbia cutoff land claims. His work is focused on intergovernmental relations among First Nations, Canada, and provinces, including treaty processes, self-government initiatives, forestry, fishing, and energy resource development, and commercial development of reserve lands. Appointed Queen's Counsel in 1998, he became a Justice of the British Columbia Supreme Court in March 2001, and a member of the Specific Claims Tribunal in November 2009. In December 2010, he was appointed chairperson of the tribunal, a position he has held for 2 consecutive 5-year terms, completed at the end of last year. Justice Slade, welcome to this discussion, and thank you for your participation. Our next speaker is my dear friend for many years, Dr. Fikret Berkes, an applied ecologist, strongly interdisciplinary in his background. He works at the interface of natural and social sciences. He received his PhD in marine sciences in 1973 and joined the University of Manitoba in 1991 as director of the Natural Resources Institute. In 2002, he was appointed Tier 1 Canada Research Chair in Community-Based Resource Management, a position he held until his retirement in 2016 as Distinguished Professor Emeritus. Dr. Berkus is a leader in research on relations between societies and their resources, on the theoretical and practical aspects of community-based management, co-management, traditional knowledge, and social ecological systems. Former president of the International Association for the Study of Common Property and leader in research and adaptive co-management, complex systems, resilience. He is perhaps best known for his book, Sacred Ecology, now in its 4th edition. And he has written many other books and articles, as a member of the Royal Society of Canada and recipient of many awards, including the Eleanor Ostrom Award from the International Association for the Study of the Commons. His most recent book is Advanced Introduction to Community-Based Conservation. Dr. Berkus, welcome to this forum. And finally, our esteemed Elder Dr. Dave Courchene, who's been on this journey from the beginning. Known to many as Nigani Aki Inini, leading Earthman, Elder Dr. Dave Courchene has touched many lives through his teachings. A respected elder and knowledge keeper of the Anishinaabe Nation, he's devoted his life to creating a healthy environment for current and future generations, carrying messages of hope and peace around the globe, and recognizing the knowledge and traditions of Indigenous peoples worldwide. Since 1992, for nearly 30 years, he has been a member of the Wisdom Keepers of the United Nations, acting in an advisory capacity in areas of spirituality and sustainable environmental stewardship. In 2002, he founded Turtle Lodge International Center for Indigenous Education and Wellness as a place of learning, healing, and sharing for all people. Dr. Courchene and Turtle Lodge, as I said, have been partners in our Reconciling Ways of Knowing Indigenous Knowledge and Science project from the outset. Dr. Courchene has built alliances with institutions, academics, and policymakers across the country, and has been recognized with many prestigious honors, including most recently an honorary doctorate of laws from the University of Winnipeg. Dr. Courchene, you continue to honor us with your wonderful contributions. And now I'm going to start the dialogue off with rather broad questions for each of our panelists. And afterwards, we'll have some follow-up comments and opportunities for questions from our viewers. We will try to keep these questions to 10 minutes or so for each speaker to allow time at the end for questions from you, our audience. We're going to start with Grandmother Whitecloud. Grandmother Whitecloud, could you take us back to the dialogue in late January connecting spirituality to the land and each other, and the discussion of the spiritual connection so many Indigenous peoples have had with the land and interrelatedness with all of creation? What do you think is most vital for decision makers, researchers, and others informed by Western scientific perspectives and training to understand about the different ways Indigenous peoples value and relate to the land and territory?
Thank you very much, Dr. Turner. Hami Jakapi, Abeton Yupia Care, Manu Kumbun Hatchet, Yopia, Chantawashtan Abetchusapia. All my relatives, it's a beautiful day. It's a good day to be happy and to be alive. And so I shake your hands with a happy heart today for this opportunity to be with you. When we last met, we had a very healthy and good discussion about our connections, our understandings as Indigenous peoples, about our relationship with land, and about our responsibilities for land, our responsibilities as Indigenous peoples, our concepts of our relationship with each other, with all of creation, and the perceived superiority of man has caused destruction to the point where we now find ourselves sitting together having these conversations and discussions to address the damage that we have inflicted on that which provides us with the greatest life possible. She provides us with everything we need to live a good life, to live a healthy, happy life, and that is our mother, the earth. As Indigenous peoples, we are of the land and we are the land. We are not separated from it. We do not have any concepts of ownership, of owning land. Our responsibility and the reason why we were placed here on Turtle Island is to care for the land, to protect her, to ensure that it continues to live and provide for all of the generations yet to come after us. Our primary responsibility in life is to be a good relative. And that is why we have the term Mitakuya Wasi in my language, which means all our relations, including everything that has been created for us to live a good life. And that we have failed miserably as the human person, the last in the order of creation, we have failed miserably in being a good relative to all of our relatives, the animals, the land, the water, the air, everything that's been created for us. We have damaged her to the extent that we are now in crisis. Our first responsibility is to be a good relative. That is what we will be remembered for. That will be our legacy. Nothing else matters. We are the last order of creation. And we have to remember that we are dependent upon everything else that was created in order for us to live and to have a good life. Mother Earth is in charge. She's leading as a living being. She is alive and breathing. And that influences the bringing forth of new life. We see that every spring. We see that with the birth not only of the animal kingdom, but also of the plant life, and lastly of human life. She shows us when we've gone too far in inflicting pain and damage to her. She lets us know. We have seen plenty of that. Earthquakes, volcanoes, massive fires, droughts, floods, hurricanes, tornadoes. And Mother Earth has even shown our political leadership at the G20 summit, or the summit that was held in Ontario a number of years ago, when an earthquake struck while they were convening their meeting. That was a message. Was that message heard? Have they done something about it? The earth is changing, so must we, in the simplest but most profound ways. Plant a garden, ride your bicycle, use less water, be careful with your garbage, do what you need to as an individual to help our Mother the Earth heal. This change that we need to embark upon is one of personal choice and personal commitment. What am I going to do to help the earth, to help our mother heal, so that my grandchildren will have the opportunity to live a good life? We can't sit back and wait for someone else to do what is our responsibility to be a good relative. More than 1 million of our relatives within the plant and animal species face extinction. That's according to the World Economic Forum just last week. More than 1 million of our relatives within the plant and animal species face extinction. We have brought it to that stage. Ancestral knowledge is embedded in our languages. We must support and participate in the revitalization of our languages, and with and through which we connect to our past, our present, and our future, where our laws are embedded, where our relationships with all living things are defined. Our language is our connection to the land. We are placed here for purpose, and our task is to find out and to understand and to fulfill that purpose. We're not here for nothing. We weren't created for nothing. We have a specific purpose. Our ancestral knowledge is the foundation for living in balance with Mother Earth and with all living things. This is our first teaching we receive, even while we are in mother's womb and when we are infants, that we need to live in balance to be able to live in a healthy world, in a healthy home, in a healthy family. The traditional knowledge of our people is rooted in laws of caring for, honoring, and protecting the land, the air, the water, the plants, the animals, the human, and the celestial worlds. Our star knowledge tells us of the approaching changes. The plant life tells us, the animals tell us of the approaching changes and dangers that we are facing now. You will hear at the beginning of many of our forums and events, and especially in our ceremonies, that we always have song lead our ceremonies and everything we do. Our songs are embedded with ecological knowledge, our ancestral knowledge, our history, and the teachings of our ancestors. Songs carry the words of our ancestors across time, transmitting key knowledge from deep in our sacred memory. We have to remember and listen to those songs. They tell us key events that have happened in our past and also tell us what is coming. It is critical that there be recognition and support for our ancestral knowledge, for an alliance with scientific knowledge, respecting each other and working together, doing what needs to be done to fulfill our responsibility to care for our Mother, the Earth. The two can work together. Not one is not greater than the other, but it is Mother Earth who will dictate the outcome. This crisis we are now in, that we have participated in, played a role in is our wake-up call and has been for at least 3 decades. When I thought back on this, 3 decades ago, my mother told me that this would happen. We have continued to turn a blind eye till we have reached this point, or we have remained sleeping because we've not listened to what our ancestors and our grandparents and our parents have told us. And in the words of our sacred pipe keeper, Arvo Looking Horse, prophecy has told us there will come a time where man's behavior has gone too far in their destructive choices. Our ancestors have shared their message through ceremony. We warned people would not be able to control what they have created. And that is where we find ourselves today. In 1994, another statement made by our sacred pipe keeper, these are now the crossroads, either be faced with global disasters, earth changes, climate changes, different sicknesses, remember COVID-19, causing tears from our relatives' eyes, or we can unite spiritually, globally, all nations, all faiths, one prayer, because we are a spiritual people. Therefore, we are spiritually connected to everything in creation. We cannot separate ourselves from that. It is who we are. It is a time that all people understand and must understand that Mother Earth is the source of all life. She is not a resource. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Grandmother Whitecloud. I could just listen to you talk for forever. You have so much wisdom there in what you've provided for us. And I just think of the one phrase that you said, songs carry the words of our ancestors. And that brings so much to me. I can hear so many people singing. It's just beautiful. Thank you so much. Our next presenter will be Minister Bennett, Carolyn Bennett. And it's a pleasure to ask you these questions, Minister Bennett. As a long-serving cabinet minister and the Minister for Crown-Indigenous Relations, you have an understanding of the ways in which government decision-making and indeed the structure of government are shaped by the Western scientific perspective, but you're also well positioned to see where the best opportunities for change and making space for Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous peoples in decisions relating to land and to each other as peoples. You've also had the opportunity to see the ways in which government may affect change on a more system-wide level, in many cases, than the courts may be able to effect. Can you tell us what you've learned about both the limits within government structures and decision processes that prove most challenging to surmount, and what are some of the most promising opportunities from within government for fundamental change in recognizing the relationships between Indigenous peoples and the land?
Kwekwe, Olakot, Tansi, hello, bonjour. Annie, Carolyn Bennett, Nidijikos, Toronto, Ninonaji Ba, Minois. Je tiens à souligner que je vous parle du territoire traditionnel de la Première Nation des Mississaugas de Credit, où nous honorons tous les peuples autochtones qui ont pagayé ces eaux et dans les mocassins ont parcouru ces terres. And I also want to honor all the traditional lands from where you are all participating today. A huge thank you to Chief Leah George Wilson for starting us in such a good way and reminding us that Indigenous knowledge is science and has been for thousands of years, but that the way means that it is about the language, the land, and the people. And so I'm so honored to be with all of you today, recognizing the inspiring leadership of Elder Dr. David Courchene and Grandmother Katherine Whitecloud, and the work of Justice Slade and Dr. Berkus and yourself, Dr. Turner. We want to also recognize the ongoing advocacy of Reconciling Ways of Knowing conveners, Miles Richardson and Dr. David Suzuki, and a very special thanks to Dr. Sabina Jazz for introducing me to Elder Courchene and the amazing work of Turtle Lodge. So it's humbling to be here. And so, Dr. Turner, I hope I'll just step back a bit and say, like so many settlers, I never learned about the true history of the country and how the perceived superiority of the settlers meant they refused to listen to the people who were here first. And so we need all Canadians on the journey of reconciliation. And I just want to share that my privilege as a member of Parliament has changed my life. It's allowed me to embark on a settler journey that has provided me with the inspiring First Nations, Inuit, and Métis teachers and friends. It has changed my understanding of this country and of being Canadian. I often talk about my 7 settler learnings, the thinking 7 generations out. Just imagine where we would be if the settlers had decided to do that. As a physician, knowing that the medicine wheel, keeping people well, mentally, physically, emotionally, and spiritually, is way better than running the medical model, which is sort of a repair shop that waits for people to get sick. The Indigenous pedagogy of learning by doing and learning on the land and learning physics and in terms of the wind and biology in terms of the animals and the plants and and chemistry by tanning a deer hide with its brain. Putting children first, listening to wise women to realize when the settlers arrived, they wouldn't even talk to the women. And also, I think as someone who's getting on, I think I'd rather aspire to be an elder than elderly. And I think that what we've seen during COVID is protecting the elders has been such an inspiration, I think, for those of us in the non-Indigenous communities. The main thing has been what I thought was feminist leadership is actually Indigenous leadership in terms of asking, not telling. So early on, I was by the settler journey of Rupert Ross. He was the former assistant Crown attorney for the District of Kenora. In his book, Indigenous Healing, he said, and what I have learned since then, Aboriginal teachings present an opposite hierarchy. Mother Earth, with her lifeblood, the waters, plays the most important role in creation. Without the soil and the water, there will be no plant realm. Without the plants, there'll be no animal realm. And without all of them, there will be no us. Within this reverse hierarchy, human creatures are understood to be the least essential and the most dependent. No longer masters of creation, we are its humble servants instead, as Katherine Whitecloud just said, that Mother Earth is clearly in charge. So I think that all Canadians need to know that we can no longer put humans at the top and try and control everything. We have to listen to and respect the law, the land, the air, and the water. Indigenous ways of knowing and the Indigenous relationship to the land is essential in informing and understanding the path towards healing and reconciliation. The relationship with the land is based on that spiritual connection to Mother Earth, founded on reverence and humility and reciprocity. As was said, that we need to be a good relative. Climate change has been a wake-up call, we hope. It is an existential threat. And I often, when people are debating climate change, remind people in my visit to Tuktoyaktuk in 1999, as we went down into the food lockers built into the permafrost, we could see the water dripping down the walls of that locker, and the elder was amazed that anybody would debate that this is happening. And so that we didn't need 20 more years of evidence. We just have to figure out what to do about it. And I think that Indigenous ways of knowing and relating to the land is going to play a pivotal role in our work to combat the effects of climate change and to protecting the land and the water and the air. So I think we've made a little bit of progress. Indigenous knowledge was incorporated into the new Environmental Assessment Act in '69. Indigenous people from coast to coast to coast are now advising on managing, conserving, and protecting the lands. They have to be there at the first idea of a project. Since 2018, the Canada Nature Fund has committed over $100 million to Indigenous conservation projects, and up to 27 Indigenous protected and conserved areas are expected to be established within 2 years under Canada's Nature Fund's Target 1 challenge. I do believe that we are taking steps to understand and share this knowledge. I'm proud that over the past few years that even in the high Arctic at the Canadian High Arctic Research Station in Cambridge Bay, Nunavut, Indigenous knowledge keepers are now part of the team, and their knowledge is recognized as fundamentally important to the co-creation of the new knowledge. The Inuit land claims give us a little bit of inspiration. It's over a fifth of the country. Because the land claims are settled, the land is protected by the boards that are made up of Inuit and then representatives from the provincial and territorial federal government. We would never anymore dream of appointing a federal representative without the approval of Inuit and their representative organizations. So there, the projects are vetted. Good projects approved, bad projects rejected, mediocre projects made better. In the Nunangat, I believe we are getting there. In the South, it's more difficult. There are only 25 self-governing nations, and as Lee Maricles always stated, the Indian Act villagized nations and then took the land in between. My job now is to support the rebuilding of those nations and accelerate the progress to self-determination. Nation rebuilding is happening. Nations are coming together. Hereditary chiefs and chief and council are working on governance models that will respect the traditional laws and customs and ensure that the will of the community is honored and get them out from under the Indian Act. We're inspired by communities like Helsik and Tunaha, and also the hard work being done by treaty governance models in which the treaty area would be able to take a decision together on the stewardship of the land and the water and the air. I think the Supreme Court decision in Chilcotin was a game changer, but standing there in tidal land, one understands that that land was surrounded by mountains. The Chilcotin people had lived there for millennia. In other parts of Canada, where communities moved and migrated, it's a little bit more complex. In some areas, elders will tell us that one nation used the land in the winter for the trap lines, but it was another nation who fished there in the summers. Land claims are therefore more difficult, but we're working very hard with nations with their research and the collaboration with Indigenous knowledge to get these issues, particularly in respect to overlap. We are optimistic that legislating the UN declarations on the rights of the Indigenous people will provide us with a roadmap for reconciliation. It in fact reaffirms that Section 35 rights are not negotiable. It actually seems that industry is also looking for the certainty that UNDRIP could provide, and I hope that would give some comfort to the provinces and territories, still a little resistant in response to the concerns that they have raised. We're going to need your help explaining to all Canadians that a new relationship based upon the affirmation of rights, respect, cooperation, and partnership, which has been written into the mandate letters of all the ministers, is the way forward. When Canadians get it, no future government would ever be able to roll that back. So we need to listen to the First Nations, Inuit, Métis elders and knowledge keepers in the urban areas as well. Here in Toronto, I look forward to the day that the children would spend days in our beautiful ravines. In conclusion, I just want to say it's important that we continue to work and to protect and uphold Indigenous people's rights and respect the importance of their relationship to the land and their leadership in protecting Mother Earth. It's essential that we work to right the significant historic wrongs that you'll hear from Justice Slade and the exclusion of Indigenous people have faced. It is a worrying time in terms of the planet, but I think it's an exciting time as we finally have mechanisms in place in which Indigenous rights holders and Indigenous knowledge are at the table when decisions are taken. And I believe that the wise counsel of knowledge keepers like Elder Courchene and Grandmother Whitecloud, we can overturn the anthropocentrism. Dr. Suzuki, I have trouble even pronouncing it, but anthropocentrism that Dr. Suzuki describes. In the Hollow Water study in 2002, it said, much of what used to be described as healing is now viewed as decolonization therapy. We need to heal Mother Earth. Grandmother Whitecloud said that we have to be a good relative. We need to listen to Indigenous knowledge keepers in order to get the two things that she described, not only better public policy, but better personal choices. I believe we can do this together. Miigwech, Kuyanamik, Marcy, thank you, merci beaucoup.
Thank you so much, Minister Bennett, for those insights and experiences and positive words for reconciliation. We appreciate it so much. And I just like your phrase, our relationship with the land is founded on reverence, humility, and reciprocity. I think that's an excellent lesson for all of us to take away today. And now it's my pleasure to introduce Justice Harry Slade. Justice Slade, you've represented Indigenous peoples as a lawyer, including on environmental issues, and have spent time working as a judge in the BC Superior Courts and as a member of the Specific Claims Tribunal. Through these experiences, you've had the opportunity to learn about the significance of the land for your Indigenous clients. You've had the opportunity and expertise to try to make your clients' perspectives heard within the Canadian legal system. And you've had the opportunity to learn much more extensively the limits and opportunities for Indigenous ways of knowing and relating to land to be recognized, respected, and reflected within the Canadian legal system. Based on this varied range of legal experience, can you tell us what you see now as the limits and opportunities for Indigenous ways of knowing and relating to the land to be recognized, respected, and reflected within the Canadian legal system?
Thank you. Nancy, Dr. Turner. I'll start by saying, I came up in the world of where rationality, as it's thought to be, was the predominant approach to problem solving, and you're breaking things down into small pieces and trying to figure out how they fit together and reassemble them for a better outcome. And that's how I was trained, and that's how I learned to approach life, both personal and professional. And in addition, of course, as a lawyer, I became steeped in an adversarial environment where outcomes were determined out of a conflict. And it's obvious now that the desired outcomes, I think the outcomes that ought to be desired have to come out of consensus, not conflict. And if we're to turn the ship around, that is Mother Earth around, to avoid environmental cataclysm, there's going to have to be a lot of discussion, a lot of dialogue, and a lot of cooperation and consensus achieved. So, within the legal system, consensus is, it's always spoken of as being the desired approach, but the legal mechanisms tend not so much to foster consensus, but rather we look for an advantage. That's what we do in litigation. That's what I used to do. Look for an advantage over the other side, so to speak, and try to use that advantage to produce the outcome desired for who you're representing. And I think we're not going to get out of this mess if that's the model that we bring to trying to resolve it. But I'm going to go now to talk a little bit about perspectives on land, because I think it's important that folks understand what the common law of Canada historical perspective is. And in the common law, the land base of a nation is considered crown land. The legal title is vested in the crown. It is government land in the sense that the use of the land is under control of government. Land located in a province is considered provincial crown land. So where is the Indigenous interest in that? Well, I'm going to get to that. But what about who owns and controls the land? And ownership is a difficult concept, especially to Indigenous peoples and cultures. So, defined parcels of land may be transferred to individuals or entities, corporations, which become in law the owner. The ownership isn't absolute. The Crown retains an underlying interest. In the hands of the individual owner, land is like any other commodity. It can, subject to provincial and municipal land use controls and environmental regulations, be used for any purpose that the owner sees fit. Now, so I listened to Elder David Courchene and to Dr. Blair Stonechild in the 7th of the series of dialogues, and their Indigenous teachings reveal a profoundly different understanding of land than the Western conception. I hope I'm doing some justice to their teachings in saying that the concept of land is entwined inextricably with the spiritual essence of humankind, and perhaps all animate beings. All knowledge emanates from the land, and it cannot be owned. This is the lesson I took from their words in the 7th of these dialogues. Now, how do you square that with Indigenous understandings of land and its meaning? Over the last 30 years, there's been a sea change in that a new understanding of land interests has emerged. This is the concept of a collective interest in land known as Aboriginal title. It's an interest that exists for the use and benefit of the collective, namely the Indigenous nation. But that may be a kind of a limiting way of looking at it in the context of what we're facing today. I say that based on the belief that we are facing an existential threat. So is there any particular definition of an interest that inheres to a particular group that's going to provide a way forward so that we can work together to head off this, what appears to be an inevitable outcome if we don't change our habits. So now I want to say a little more about Aboriginal title land from the perspective of Canadian law. it is owned, and I appreciate the difficulty with the concept of ownership, but in the law, the Supreme Court has said Aboriginal title land is owned and controlled by the Indigenous nation. And unlike in the case of privately or individually owned land, the Crown has no remaining interest. This is extremely significant, that this idea that the Crown has an underlying interest in all ownership interests in land is gone, where it has been determined that the Indigenous or Aboriginal title of an Indigenous nation has been established. How is it established? Until Courchene, the court said, by the declaration of a court or by formal recognition by governments. And I ask myself this question: is adoption and implementation of the UN Declaration a form of recognition of Indigenous title held by the Indigenous nations that establishes Indigenous ownership and control? And I'll say a little more about that momentarily. So it seems to me whether UNDRIP and the implementation of UNDRIP by governments, and we have Canada and the province of British Columbia, whether or not that establishes the title of Indigenous nations to their traditional territories, there's a strong message and impetus in there to embrace the other perspective, other than the old Canadian formalistic legal perspective, in viewing what land means to us collectively as Canadians. And it may be that Indigenous ways of knowing and relating to land may become recognized, respected, and reflected within the Canadian family and legal system through, if not formal declarations of Indigenous or Aboriginal title, but through the recognition that there are things to be said that are of huge value about how we look at land. And that's more of a societal perspective and a change in societal perspective than necessarily a legal one, in my view. So I just, now I've already mentioned that in the Canadian common law, Indigenous title land gains that status only if declared by a court or by formal acknowledgement by the relevant governments. Now, what happens once that happens is that the power of government to infringe upon the Indigenous interest in the land, for example, to enter or allow entry by others, is restricted unless the infringement can satisfy the test set out in Courchene for justification of the intrusion. And it's a difficult test to meet, in my view, but it's still there. And the Supreme Court of Canada has said that is not a veto, but it's a hard test to meet. Now, before proof of title, we know that there's an obligation on the part of governments who issue resource tenures or land grants to consult and accommodate with the apparent Indigenous owner of title. And we've seen a lot of activity in this area by way of judicial review of government issued tenures and licenses and resource extraction permits and the like. So what difference do we have with the advent of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples? I think this is largely unknown, and it's an area where there's a lot to learn and a lot of work, in my view, to do before we can really understand the significance of the Declaration. Now, some of the work that, in my view, has to be done, I thought should have been done at the onset upon adoption and implementation. Honourable Minister Bennett asked me in our rehearsal about consent. From whom is consent sought? This is a very difficult and vexing problem, because, as I mentioned, of the balkanization of the Indigenous nations by the Indian Act. Rather than perhaps 50 Indigenous nations, we've got 634 bands, 230 or so bands in Canada, and the work of early anthropologists in consultation with elders, knowledge keepers, have proposed that there are perhaps 23 Indigenous nations in British Columbia. This presents a very difficult challenge for governments and, I think, for industry. Who do you talk to if you wish to advance, say, a resource project or anything else that takes place upon the land? When we speak of recognition, what is being recognized? Is it the territorial extent of the Indigenous nation owner in the Aboriginal title sense? Well, who is the owner? What is the extent of the territory? Article 27 of UNDRIP, in my view, well, on the face of it, contemplated the creation of a process by Indigenous leaders, Indigenous institutions, and government by which these things could become known. It does not seem to me that that has happened. I've heard no references from government officials to Article 27 and to what it appears to call for. So I think Indigenous peoples and Canadians of non-Indigenous ancestry alike are faced with these deep questions over whose interest is recognized by UNDRIP, and how can the holders, the putative holders, be identified with some semblance of reliability. And I find it very difficult to think through how UNDRIP can make that big a difference when it comes to determining Indigenous territorial interests without some process by which these things can become known. Now, in 1997, the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples recommended the creation of a tribunal to facilitate this learning. And they also recommended a tribunal to deal with specific claims. Well, the Conservative government, actually the Harper government, created the tribunal, the Specific Claims Tribunal. nothing has been done to create a tribunal to facilitate the resolution and the identification of the Indigenous nations and their territories in a way so that they can generally be known. Indigenous peoples know who they are. They understand the extent of their territories, but it's important that there be a more broad-based understanding of that if Indigenous peoples, in my view, are to have the voice they should have in determining government policy and how we move forward with a different understanding based on their knowledge of the meaning of land. So thank you for your patience and your attention. I'll conclude with that, and I look forward to any questions that anyone may have down this morning, and to, if I haven't disgraced myself, further participation in this very important dialogue. And by the way, I'm going to trim that dreadful CV resume down. It's way too long. It's sort of tiresome to hear it. Okay, there you go.
Thank you, Justice Slade. Thank you so much. And you've raised a number of really important points that that we all need to be thinking about in terms of this broad question. And I like the phrase you used, from conflict to consensus. I think that's what we need to be working towards. And now our next question will be directed to Dr. Fikret Berkes. Fikret, you've spent years as an applied ecologist studying the relations between societies and their resources and exploring numerous possibilities for connections, collaborations, and convergences between scientific understandings of land and our place on Earth and Indigenous understandings of our sacred relationships to the land. Reflecting on your experience and research, what are your thoughts and insights on how we can better bring these unique ways of knowing and being into conversation together in a way that fosters the best relationships amongst peoples and facilitates the best stewardship?
Thank you, Nancy, for the introduction. Thank you for the organizers, the conveners, the previous speakers, and Chief Leah for the opening to put us up on our right foot. I'm speaking. You have me as an applied ecologist. I'm not really purely a scientist. I've been working in an interdisciplinary area. So I'm speaking as a teacher, nearing almost 50 years now. I'm university teaching, and as a scholar and an elder. But except in this group, I'm usually I'm the elder in a group, but in this company, in fact, there are elders of higher stature. One of the things I learned from Indigenous elders is that it's always good to start with a story. So that's what I'm going to do. It's a story from the Western Canadian Arctic. In spring, when the sea ice starts to melt, a freshwater layer develops on top of the denser salt water below. And from the 90s, mid to late 90s, the Inuit were reporting that this freshwater layer was getting deeper and deeper. So some of these observations trickled down to scientists, oceanographers who are meeting in Washington. They have a yearly meeting of Arctic oceanographers, and they were pretty skeptical. They said, well, how would the Inuit know? Of course, it does make sense that if there's melting and more rapid melting, there will be more fresh water in spring. But remember, this is before year 2000. So people, in fact, were not convinced of climate change, even though there was evidence, as Minister Bennett pointed out, in all kinds of other ways. But the oceanographers were saying, well, could be just a decadal anomaly. Let's just wait for a while. But in the meantime, the Inuit observation is very interesting. But how would they know? How would they know? They don't have all these toys and equipment that scientists have. Well, I didn't know the answer either, but I thought maybe I can find out. So I was in Sachs Harbor and I started talking to people, and it turns out very interestingly that seal hunting is the important thing. When people hunt seals, in the fall they float, they have a lot of fat, so it's easy to retrieve them. But when you shoot a seal in spring, after the fat deposits have been depleted, the seal sinks, and the seal usually sinks slowly, but all the way down to the level where this denser salt water starts. So what the Inuit do is they use a grappling hook, like picture a sort of a giant fish hook that you dangle and you try to snag the seal and bring it up. These hunters hate losing an animal once they've shot it, so they don't mind spending hours. I mean, who says hunting is easy? They work and they can bring that seal up most of the time, some of the time. So they know how much rope they have to let out. And what they were finding was that as you approach the end of the 90s, you had to leave a lot more rope to be able to snag that seal. So that freshwater layer was actually getting deeper, and they really did know, even though Inuit hate quantification, they knew that in some places they had to let out almost twice as much line to just snag that seal. So this was picked up by one oceanographer, Canadian oceanographer, who actually takes Indigenous knowledge seriously, and then of course the rest is history. A lot of oceanographic expeditions, they measured, they quantified everything, published papers. So by year 2000, 2001, 2002, it was actually well known that this phenomenon, known and obvious to the Inuit, were actually picked up by scientists. So that is an interesting story, but the main point is there are scientists receptive to Indigenous knowledge, and they can understand it, they can follow it, and they can follow it up with their own science, which is rather nice. So I think we're in a very interesting era right now. Ways of knowing, ways of relating to the land are being picked up by scientists, are being picked up to some extent by general public. It's been a slow process. It's not really that easy, but it's happening in a number of areas. Minister Bennett referred to climate change. Yes, climate change adaptation. We're learning from Indigenous knowledge. There's scientific literature on quite a few of these areas. Well, all of these areas. Indigenous knowledge as a source of biological information, medical knowledge, source of ecological insights, conservation biology, protected areas, environmental monitoring, environmental assessment. In each of these areas, we are actually learning from Indigenous knowledge. So these are the connections between the two ways of knowing, one of Nancy's questions. And some of this is related to what scientists call paradigm change going on in environmental studies. When I was a graduate student in the last millennium, we studied ecological cycles in a very mechanistic kind of way, sort of solar power drives all these ecological cycles like nutrient cycles, biogeochemical cycles. We now take much more of a holistic approach. Of course, even though many ecologists still pursue reductionistic kind of ecology, we do try to take a holistic approach, which gets us closer to Indigenous ways of knowing. As well, we're trying to put humans back into the environment. it may not come as a surprise to you, but still most of ecology excludes humans. So it's more in the environmental studies area that we're trying to put people back in. And in doing so, we are in fact learning from indigenous knowledge. So there's a knowledge revolution going on. We are talking about multiple ways of knowing. We're talking about multiple epistemologies. We're talking about knowledge pluralism. Now, I'm not saying everybody buys into these, either scientists or indigenous knowledge holder, but there are serious work going on, including, of course, our symposium here. So the issue is, how do we get these two ways of knowing into a conversation, or how do we advance that conversation? And how do we improve relationship really among the peoples, and how do we facilitate stewardship? These, again, questions for our panel. There are some important considerations and cautions when we get into that area. One, of course, is that there are many indigenous peoples and there are many kinds of indigenous knowledge. Not every group has the same knowledge as any other group, but there are a lot of commonalities among the indigenous groups within Canada and also internationally. Also, I would say there's similarities with science as well. I mean, I'm talking about Western science and indigenous knowledge. And these similarities tend to be more in the areas of empirical knowledge, practical knowledge, but the big differences are in the areas of different worldviews, different belief systems, and of course, relation to the land and that hierarchy that speakers referred to, reversing that hierarchy has to do with worldviews. And I'm not sure we're going to change that overnight. That's going to be very slow. The context here is that we're in the age of reconciliation. Reconciliation is not simply saying we're sorry. Reconciliation is about decolonizing and sharing power. And part of that decolonizing is decolonizing knowledge. Indigenous knowledge is not free to share. For example, the medicinal knowledge of Amazon indigenous people in the 1960s were stolen by some very prominent scientists from very prominent educational institutions like Harvard. There are now safeguards against this. A previous speaker referred to the United Nations Declaration, UNDRIP, and there are safeguards in Canada as well for pirating indigenous knowledge. So how do we, well, the problem is there's a power differential between indigenous knowledge and science with its huge infrastructure, funding, many scientists doing much science and so on. So how do we deal with this unequal power relationship? Some people talk about synthesizing knowledge, integrating knowledge. Our experience is that carries the danger that indigenous knowledge can be taken out of its cultural context. So in my work, I talk about bridging knowledge. There are other metaphors. Robin Kimmerer, who's an indigenous scholar as well as a biologist, talks about braiding knowledge. He's using braiding as a metaphor for, as in braiding sweetgrass. One talks about two-eyed seeing. One talks about the two-row wampum, which is symbolic of there's a wampum belt with two streams running parallel but connect together now and then. So the main idea here is that you need to bring together the two kinds of science, the two ways of knowing, with the idea that the integrity of each way of knowing has to be maintained and respected, but the two sides can collaborate, cooperate on things of mutual interest and help one another. So here we talk about knowledge co-production, applying these different kinds of knowledge together to solve problems. Well, again, climate change is an obvious one and already referred to by Minister Bennett. Minister Bennett, I'm so impressed with your knowledge of all these things. But knowledge co-production isn't just giving indigenous knowledge to the scientists. It's about sharing power, sharing how problems are posed, sharing the decision on what methods should be used, sharing the collection of data, sharing the interpretation of what these data mean. In other words, it's a partnership of equals. It's not indigenous peoples, just giving to scientists what the scientists may or may not use. So in conclusion, facilitating that knowing and relating to the land, I think has to start with decolonization of knowledge in the first place. Before we can get that knowledge pluralism and all that knowledge co-production. Indigenous knowledge and science can be used as equal partners through sharing of power. Already mentioned the idea of humility. Scientists are not famous for the humility of people's place in the ecosystem. Of course, we can use also more of, sometimes people refer to as the 4 R's: respect, responsibility, relations, reciprocity. Science doesn't have any of this, but it can, and many scientists do. So can scientists do these things in terms of knowing and relating to the land? Well, some can and do, including my dear colleague, Dr. Turner, who should really look at some of her work. But many scientists at this point do not and cannot. This is not science as far as they're concerned. Maybe they stick to science, and we have to respect that. Can Canadian society do these things? Well, I think they can recognize indigenous ways of knowing and learn from them. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Fikret, Dr. Berkus, for those really, I think, very positive ideas, bringing together knowledge in a good way and recognizing indigenous knowledge systems as being the mutual support that can be offered for all of us for the benefit of Mother Earth. I think that's the message that you gave us, and really appreciate that. Our final question for this part of our presentation will be to Dr. Elder Dave Courchene, who I've come to love and respect over the time that we've been working together, and really appreciate always his wisdom and his contributions to this bigger question. Elder Dave Courchene, you know several of our panelists today fairly well and have had many opportunities over the years for dialogue with them. And at the same time, you have great insights into the ways in which Indigenous knowledge and relations to land and all of creation are guided by spirit. Reflecting on all you've heard in the course of the conversations today, could you share your wise reflections on where we go from here as diverse peoples living on these lands together and into the future?
Thank you so much, Nancy. Bonjour, Anin. Nene magnetok. Nigani aki nene. Dishne cause. Kinyo do dem saging donji Anishinaabe Elder. Chibo abaji tuana nene chigi gitan wemstigoji. No de abaji tongenin. Aningagi jimini goes at gain Anishinaabe chi. Chinon dagozet. Get no Niviwatan Anishinaabe Gewinchi Chikinamaget. Vida Shuega is a Chikiang Wenongum. And the way when the Mage gaining Animinic gaving a show in dog was it Anishinaabe. You know, it's always been my pride that I have in being Anishinaabe, you know, to always begin by honoring the language that we have been given as a people. And it's been said over and over again by the knowledge keepers and the ones that speak the language so fluently. It's in the language that carries, you know, the knowledge that we speak. Our language is embedded, you know, with that knowledge. And of course, it's embedded from that relationship that we have with the land. And in reflecting in today's world, and we have been able to witness firsthand, you know, the continued destruction of our home, you know, and yet, you know, we pride ourselves in evolving technologically, scientifically, and yet we have failed to find a way to be able to work together for the benefit of everyone. You know, and we're continually reminded, you know, in our lodges that everything that we do in our daily life is to benefit the children. Whatever we do, we must reflect and ask ourselves, is this going to benefit our children? Is this going to benefit the land itself? And I reflect on, you know, on the history of our people. And we've had to endure a lot, you know, in order to maintain our memory of a knowledge that we know can really set the foundation for a new world. You know, people talk about a new paradigm, a new narrative. And if the first peoples are allowed to take the lead in setting that foundation, I believe that we will find a way to find resolve to the current challenges that we face. We can't afford to continue living in a society that only reflects one dominant view. You know, there's many that have arrived on our homeland that have come with their own unique knowledge, but yet we're all led by one dominant view of how we should govern ourselves, how we should treat the land. And the spirit and intent of Reconciling Ways of Knowing was to offer an environment of inclusion, that people that would be invited to speak would bring forward the uniqueness of their understanding of how are we going to resolve these current challenges that we face in today's world. And there's absolutely no doubt from what we are experiencing together as humanity, there needs to be some very, very significant changes that need to be made. And we don't have a lot of time in order to make those changes because so much is happening that is destroying the very life that we need in order to live and to survive. And as Indigenous people, you know, we've sat by, not by choice. I think we've always wanted to participate and be equal partners in finding solutions that confront all of us. But still, you know, we remain marginalized in our homeland. We remain under the environment of domination. And even if we were to take our case to the court, it would not work in our favor because your whole court system is based on that dominant view of having full ownership and domination over the land, which was really created by the papal bulls, you know, that gave the right to certain people to have dominance over the land. And unless we're able to reveal the truth of what's really happening, there will never be reconciliation in this country. When we have to somewhat be honest about the past and what has happened, and the result of that being excluded, you know, as the first peoples of our homeland, you know, that should not continue to happen. And I realize, and many of the knowledge keepers realize, that there's a lot of work to be done. It's not that we do not want to share what we have, because now we're coming forward to, you know, to share what we believe is the best of who we are And it's that spirit of knowledge and understanding that we have as a spirit. I feel somewhat handicapped when we do these things using virtual reality or whatever, because what is important for our people is the ceremonial context that needs to be done if we're going to have any hope of finding a solution to what we need to do. And this is where the lodges of our people become very, very important, paramount in finding a solution, because we have always been in a position, you know, in our relationship with the spirit, that we humble ourselves. And when we say that Mother Earth is a living entity, we mean that from the fullness of our heart, that she is alive. And being alive, she has a knowledge. Many refer it to as a higher intelligence. And what we should have, you know, in our homeland is the full voice of Indigenous people and the teachings that they have, and the rules of conduct that should be shared on how we should be treating, you know, our homeland, which is a homeland to all of us now. We know that things change, and, you know, but still we try to find ourselves, you know, with the right to be able to live our identity. When I speak my language, it reminds me, you know, it wasn't that long ago when by law we were prevented of practicing anything that reflected our way of life, and it harmed our people right to this point in time in our current reality. You know, we continue to live in loss of memory of the way of life of our ancestors. We've been very, very fortunate and lucky to have a few people that have remained faithful to that way of life and kept the language alive and kept the ceremonies alive. And this is where we need to offer more investment and more support for people that carry that knowledge. You know, for me personally, I've been, you know, trying to appeal to my brothers and sisters that have arrived on our homeland. Help us to, you know, to share this message that we have, you know, help support our own infrastructures, you know, that can share this higher knowledge of spirit. You know, you have all kinds of institutions of education, universities, colleges, or whatever. But where is the college of the land that the Indigenous people are holding? Why is it so difficult for Indigenous people, you know, to be given proper support and investment for what they know? I'm encouraged that there are people today, you know, such as the ones we have on the panel today, you know, they're speaking our language. But what is important is to position the Indigenous people into their rightful place of leadership, because we are the true leaders of our homeland. No one can take that away from us. We've never went to another land and try and dominate another people from another part of the world, because we know that is not right. But we are to respect each other's territory. We're to respect, you know, the creation of where Indigenous people were put, and we were put in this part of the world that we call Turtle Island, and we hold this knowledge. We've been evolving here for tens of thousands of years, you know, by the sacred fires, you know, inviting the spirit to give us this knowledge and this teaching that was prophesied that the time would come when we would share it. And we want to share it now. We want to share this knowledge, but we need the support of people like yourself and saying, you know, let us build a place. Let us take the lead for that. We'll show you what we need. No one's going to come and find the answer for us as a people. That answer has to come from the people itself. And what is absolutely important right now is the education of the children. All children need to learn about the land so that they will come to appreciate supporting the natural laws of the land that will ensure there'll be future for everybody. So that would be, you know, my thought this morning is, you know, appealing to the hearts of people that are of the heart to say, yes, let's just do it. Why can't the proper resourcing? Because we have the people in place. We have our professors in place, but they have no place. We do have a turtle lodge, but it has to be much more supported in terms of the infrastructure that are needed, you know, to support our knowledge keepers, you know, to share the teachings. So I want to thank everybody, you know, that was on panel here today. that you've allowed yourself to come forward and share, your knowledge and your wisdom. So I wish every one of you the best and the best that life can offer. Miigwech.
Thank you so much, Dr. Courchene. As always, you inspire me and so many others. And the vision that you have for colleges of the land, I can see those right across the country, in the north and in the south, places where this rich knowledge can be disseminated, the languages can be disseminated, the languages of the land. I really love that idea. And maybe it's something we can all think about is what could happen. We'll move on now to some comments from our two conveners who are with us today, as well as Dr. Courchene, who is one of our original conveners, but two of the key people who I've admired so much for the work that they do, Miles Richardson and Dr. David Suzuki, of course. And I want to welcome you both to this series and ask if you would like to offer some reflections on the discussion or pose questions to any of or all of the panelists. And maybe we'll start with you, Dr. David Suzuki.
Thank you. What a wonderful session this has been, both in demonstrating that there are really good people who get the problems that we have and how serious the problems are and what the solutions might be. Fikret, I was just amazed at the story you told at the top of your presentation. It's that kind of knowledge. I don't call it science. It's just these are what Indigenous people have known and used in order to survive. Very different from science. We do science, we publish a paper and we get a raise. I mean, big deal. So that was a wonderful story. And I was reminded of Dr. Ian Morrow's story when he did the film in 4 different Inuit villages. He interviewed elders talking about the change in climate. And in all 4 villages, elders said, we noticed the stars have moved. And of course, then people began to say, well, what the hell? You see, that Indigenous knowledge is baloney, like we're talking physics and astronomy. And then after his film came out, Russian scientists discovered that as the atmosphere warms, in fact, it alters the transmission of light to the surface of the planet. So in fact, the stars have moved. And that kind of observation only comes from deep, long-standing observation over time. I just want to say that it becomes so crystal clear. We've got good people, Minister Bennett and Harry and Fikret, who understand what the issues are. We're trapped. We're trapped in, you said it right, Minister Bennett, is anthropocentric. We're trapped in an anthropocentric way. We've changed from what humanity has known since the beginning of time. They've known that we live within a complex web of relationships with other species of animals, of all the plants, of air, water, soil, and sunlight. People have always understood that. And when you're one strand in that complex web, you've got to behave in the right way to ensure that that web of relationships remains intact. And ceremony has been one of the strong, powerful ways of reminding ourselves of that. But the anthropocentric shift, which I believe, well, I hate to say this, but it's enshrined in the Judeo-Christian tradition that really saw humans as elevated. We were special. I mean, Jesus Christ was a human being, but he said he was the Son of God. So that elevates us. We're not like all our relatives out there. We're we're special. And of course, in Genesis book 1, chapter 28, it says, go forth and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it. The Renaissance began that whole process where we saw that knowledge is power, and that, you know, I am because I can think. I think, therefore I am. The whole idea that our intellect somehow elevated us out of nature, and that provided us with the power that we could use in our lives. And of course, the Industrial Revolution really sank the whole biocentric way of seeing ourselves, because we realized, you know, Dave Courchene has talked about natural law that Indigenous people understand and respect. But why should we think of natural law when we're so smart? We can create telescopes and microscopes and machines that will travel faster than the speed of sound. We can live in outer space or down deep in the ocean. We don't have to pay any attention to natural law. We're so smart. And that whole idea that we are at the top infuses our laws. When I think here, listen to Harry saying, you know, how do we actually begin to use UNDRIP in a way? It's so goddamn complicated by that legal system. And, you know, it's we're in charge. And we, you know, Quebec recently recognized the right of a river. And oh, that's great. But who the hell do we think we are, having the right to give rights to everything else on earth? Like, what about the right of a bird to live its life as it evolved, or the right of a river to flow as it has for thousands, the right of a forest to exist as a community of organisms? I mean, who the hell do we think we are? And again, the economic system, which we've now elevated to the source of everything that matters to us. We don't see that Earth is our mother and gives us all that we need and use. No, it's the economy. We had a prime minister for 9.5 years who said acting on climate change is crazy economics. It'll destroy the economy. So he elevated the economy above the very atmosphere that gives us air to breathe, that gives us weather, climate, and the seasons. Sorry, I'm launched into my rant now, and this is not what you want. You know, but our legal systems, our economic systems, and our political systems are all about us. And I think it's the challenge now is, can we find that way of seeing the world, what Fikret called a worldview, the worldview that recognized Earth is our mother, and all of the ways that we have to behave. That's the challenge. For me, I say that we have this unbelievable opportunity, which is there are still people who have struggled to protect their land, what little of it was left, who have struggled to protect their language and their culture. And we're on the brink of that disappearing, but they are the ones that can still show us another way. In order to do that, to show us the leadership, they need the land back. Now, Harry said that we claim this land, all this crown land. That's Indigenous land. Give it back. They don't have the sense of ownership that we do, but they need that land to perform their responsibility of caring for it. And the Guardian program that Miles has been heavily involved in, I think, is a very powerful way of strengthening and enriching these communities that have to be the leaders in the way that we go forward. But we don't have much time. Sorry, that's my rant. Miles, maybe you can go on.
David, I have to say, I love your rants. I think we all need to hear them. They're also, it's so important. The message that you bring loud and clear, and you've helped to change many minds and already, and to inspire so many of us. So thank you for that. Really appreciate it. And Miles, last but not least, obviously, Officer of the Order of Canada and citizen of the Haida Nation, please give us your comments about what you've heard today?
There's nothing more to say, Nancy. I just want to thank all the panelists for a fascinating morning and a continuation of the Indigenous Elders panel we had a couple of weeks ago, and this complementing that panel has been amazing. Thank you all. And but I'm drawn, and I got two questions, and so I'm drawn to the political legal aspect of what came on amidst all the amazing information that came forward this morning. And I'm with Dr. Dave Courchene. Let's just do it. I mean, we're in a serious situation as humans. We have the roadmaps. We know what to do. We've got to find the will to do it. And these discussions help us to figure out what those things are. And I think those decisions are I mean, the things that we need to do are fairly simple. To do them would change our world, and we need some world changing for the better. So my questions are to Minister Bennett and to Justice Slade. First of all, to Minister Bennett, one of the where am I going to start here? We've had so many conversations, Minister, about nationhood. Your government appropriately established the objective in relations with Indigenous people as reestablishing a proper nation-to-nation relationship. And yet we keep falling short on actually getting to that level of building a partnership as equals and addressing the challenges in front of us together. And we're not far away from doing that. You know, we've had, as Dr. Suzuki has reminded us, some successes around building a national Indigenous Guardians Network supported by the government and people of Canada that brings out the ceremony and the relationship of Indigenous people. We need to figure out how to establish a table of equals as human beings. And my question to you is, what's the obstacle to federal government recognition of Indigenous or Aboriginal title, as Justice Slade referred to it? You know, we have all the roadmaps we need. We have the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples reported 25 years ago, and it had all the answers we need to establishing this relationship. Justice Slade reminded us they called for a Specific Claims Tribunal, and I think more importantly, a nationhood tribunal, so that we can work to get this relationship right. Establishing the legal connection of Aboriginal title is already in Canadian law. Justice Slade said there's two ways to establish that: a declaration of the court or a recognition by the relevant government. First Nations have been asking Canada to do this since contact. Now is the time to do it. What's the obstacle of recognizing our peoples at a government to government level as equals? That would make UNDRIP, that would make the TRC, that would make all that work. But that's my question to you, Minister. What's the obstacle to us to providing recognition of the Aboriginal title of Indigenous people? And my question to Justice Slade is sure, the road to recognition of Aboriginal title, there's two ways. As you said, one, declaration of the courts, two, recognition by the relevant government. But what if none of those happen? What if the courts don't provide that declaration and the Canadian governments, the Crown governments, don't bring that acknowledgement. What's the opportunity, Justice Slade, for Indigenous people to enact, to assert our own law within the constitutional construct of Canada? Now, I don't think it's a tough assumption for a judge to accept that Indigenous people are human beings, worthy of possessing rights. Let's assume we get over that hump, and that we continue to possess the capacity to implement our ancient rights. Our rights aren't going to be a modern construct. They're going to be a continuation of ancient history to assert those. And why can't Section 35 just manifest that as a third route to establishing Aboriginal title? Anyway, I'm answering the question before I even ask you. So thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Jackie. Those are my two questions. Maybe there are more statements than questions, but.
Thank you so much, Miles.
Nancy, sorry.
No worries. Jackie's there too. She's really running everything that we're doing. And those are great questions. We also have many questions from our wonderful viewers, more than we can possibly address in the time that we have remaining, which is just over 10 minutes now. And Justice Slade, do you want to?
Yeah, I'd very much like to try to speak to the questions that Dr. Suzuki and Miles Richardson have raised. You know, what's in the way of recognition of Aboriginal title vested in all of the Indigenous nations, in my view, is that it is a scary thing. Why is it scary? Because the system of land ownership in Western society, in Canada, that I've described, is in many ways the foundation for the economy that sustains us all. Ownership of land, ownership of the right to extract resources is in many ways the anchor for an economy. And we're in this most unusual situation internationally, in that there has been found by our courts to exist a title, a form of ownership that exists underneath all of that. And nobody knows what the consequence will be of a determination of Indigenous ownership in the form of Aboriginal title for the security of those tenures that anchor so much of the economy. And it's for that reason that I believe that the dialogue that has to happen is one that somehow reconciles what exists to anchor our economy with the proper recognition of Indigenous ownership. And you know, courts are the worst place to deal with that. Absolutely the worst. Going to court is a zero-sum game. Courts cannot reconcile. They cannot. So I think we need a process, and frankly, I'm very disappointed in governments with respect, Minister Bennett, because I think we need to create a process that is respectful, and voices have to be heard, not just the voice of government, not just the voice of business, not just but the voice of Indigenous peoples with their perspectives. And how are we going to do that unless we create a forum in which that can happen? I believe that's necessary. Just one little story. When I signed up for the Specific Claims Tribunal, I mean, there seemed to be an interest, even in the Harper government, in having me do that because I had a background. What kind of background? Entirely advocating for Indigenous interests. So when I got to Ottawa, I thought, well, how can we create an institution that is populated by Superior Court judges that's going to be accepted? And I thought, if we're going to be accepted, we have to be respected. And if we're going to be respected, we have to show respect. And how did we do that? Well, we took our process to the communities. And as I was counseled to do by my mentor, we listened. And sometimes you're listening to information that is of no particular assistance in coming to a decision in determining the outcome of a particular claim. The point is, you listen. And you're not just there, it's not just BS. You want to know what is said and you respect it. And it surprised me a little bit about how what we learned from the community found its way actually in a tangible way into the decisions. So you take a little chance, you create a different process that's designed to show respect, you get respect, you hear voices, and you get surprised by the outcomes. There's more value in it than even from my kind of anal lawyerly perspective than I anticipated. So, I really believe that we need to craft a process that is respectful in order that a proper dialogue can take place. And I could be talking all day. I'm going to shut up now, but maybe there'll be an opportunity in the future.
Thank you, Justice Slade, for that. And unfortunately, our time is shrinking rapidly, and we won't have time to address all the wonderful questions that are coming in for all of the panelists in this session. I know that Dr. Suzuki needs to leave right at 11, and that's when we will stop this session altogether. But we will find a way of addressing the questions that Jackie might talk about towards the end. And in the few minutes that are left, I want to see if Minister Bennett, you were addressed by Justice Slade and also by Miles. Do you have any comments that you want to make at this point?
Yes, I mean, I just think that I'm optimistic. I think that there have been obstacles, but it's finally since Section 35 that hopefully people are figuring out that to spend all this time and money to lose in court is not a way forward. So that people have to sit down at the table and they have to be able to meaning from industry to provinces and territories to the federal government, that we have to be there and understand the harms that were done under the Indian Act, and how do we help support nation rebuilding and their stewardship of the land and the water and the air. So I think we've got a willing province in British Columbia. And I think that where we've ended up with that recognition and reconciliation of rights policy, we've been able to move things forward. We've got rid of the irritants of cede and surrender and extinguishment. It's no longer on loans. This is about coming together as partners in a tripartite way, because one of the problems is that the land, as was said, at the moment is the purview of provinces and territories. And so we've got somehow to get the provinces and territories at the table so that we can deal with the land properly and also be able to build that kind of governance that is based on traditional legal customs and all of that. I think also the Indian Act, by creating these dueling governance of the chief and council and the traditional leadership, we also have to be able to support the time and the space it takes for them to develop their vision and the support of their communities to be able to say what it is that they would want as a partnership with Canada and the nation. But I think we're going to get there. I think that we've got over half of the Indian Act bands now at one of the rights recognition tables, working on their jurisdiction, and whether it's child and family or whether it's fishing or whether it's others, we're going to get there. But it is going, at the moment, you know, the reaction of some of the provinces and territories on the UN declaration is disappointing. You know, the sky didn't fall in British Columbia. Let's just get on with that respect of a true partnership and the legal pluralism that we talked about, or the knowledge pluralism this is about. You know, it is about recognition of rights, respect, cooperation, partnership. But I think Canadians are coming with us, and we're going to just keep going. And I hope that we will be able to sort out the land problem. Interesting during COVID, when people, I probably shouldn't say this out loud, but in COVID, where people said, how come Australia did better at the beginning? You know, and it'll be the political scientists, or that they learned from our mistakes and didn't give up as much authorities to the provinces or to the states in Australia. And I think that we are struggling when it comes to the land and being able to find willing partners that understand that they'll just lose in court. So why don't they get with the program?
Thank you, Minister Bennett. And Dr. Berkus and Grandmother Whitecloud and Dr. Courchene, there are many questions that our audience have posed that we won't have time to respond to, but we'll find a way to get those questions to you so you can see what people are wondering and maybe find a way to provide answers for them. And so with that, it's time to draw this to a close, and it's my pleasure to first of all thank the team behind the scenes, Eden and Jackie and all the others who have been there for us and looking after all of the technicalities behind this, making it all work. Thank you so much. And then to invite Chief Leah George Wilson to provide us with the spiritual and territorial closing for this event.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me to provide a closing. This was a wonderful panel right from the beginning, when we heard from Grandmother Katherine, who said we need to be a good relative to future generations and our Creator, all the way through the discussions around the science and the stories associated to the legal aspects, to what's happening politically and where we are and what can happen, up to the importance to Indigenous people is the ceremony, which we kind of miss out in these kinds of discussions. Really keep that in the front of your minds. That ceremonial context is really what we need in our lives. And I think you can see that in the dominant society, as Elder Courchene says, and spoke to the colleges of land. I really liked David Suzuki's rant. And Miles, you had two questions. We could have stayed here for a couple of hours hearing the responses to those questions. This has been an amazing time, and I really enjoyed hearing about the possibilities of UNDRIP, but also thinking in lines with the elders and Miles we need to just do it. We need to get down to the business of taking care of Mother Earth and having that shift in the way that we all think. Wish you well in your day and take good care. Haitsepka, thanking all of you.
Haitsepka, Haichka, yourself, Chief George Wilson, thank you for being with us and for the wonderful way that you have to open and close our session. And now just Jackie Miller might have a few little housekeeping remarks to just to finish off. And thank you all for listening to us and being part of this session. So many things to think about.
Thank you, Nancy. And thank you also Chief George Wilson, Grandmother Whitecloud, Minister Bennett, Justice Slade, Dr. Berkus, Elder Courchene, David, Miles, and to all of our audience participants for sharing your time and thoughtfulness with us today. I just wanted to make a note about the Q&A. This is a very big panel discussion that we've had today, much bigger than many of our previous ones, trying to bring together a discussion between two ways of knowing and bring together today's discussion with the previous discussion. And as a result of the deepness of the knowledge and perspective sharing that we've had today, it has taken us some more time than anticipated. And we recognize that everyone's schedules, or many people's schedules, are such that they have other commitments that they need to move on to. So unfortunately, we haven't been able to get to the Q&A, but wanted to just recognize as Reconciling Ways of Knowing how important your participation as the audience participants is to us, and that we fully intend to get to your questions in all our future sessions. And what we will do in this case is take down all of the questions that have been provided in the Q&A and do a couple of things with those. And that will include synthesizing the questions together. And on our website, what we do after every session is we put up a recording. And when we put up the recording, we will also put the synthesized questions with our best ability to address them there. And we share out the recording via email as well. So you'll be able to access that in those two ways. And in addition to that, we are planning our future programming for the rest of the year, and we'll work to try to address some of your questions through how we design the rest of our programming for the rest of the year, because I'm sure some of your questions have to do with how can we apply this, and a number of other things. So we will very seriously take your questions and work to address them, as well as hopefully trying to find ways to actually bring the questions forward and address them in our future sessions. So primarily just wanted to acknowledge how important it is that you've asked your questions today and that we will follow up on them in those ways. And I just also wanted to note that we'll be sending out a short survey. It's been posted in the chat, and we hope that you can take some time to share your thoughts with us. And we'll be following up soon about our upcoming program plans as we develop them, and we look forward to sharing that with you. And you can find out about that by signing up to our mailing list at waysofknowingforum.ca or on LinkedIn, Twitter, and Facebook. And last but not least, we appreciate any donations you can provide to support our ongoing programming and to support this really important conversation between ways of knowing and between Indigenous peoples' knowledge and Canadian legal and other institutional decision-making processes, which which we're hoping to influence in changing how they work to come to a better place together. So on that note, thank you very much for joining us today, and we appreciate all of your time.